The national fight for civil rights has dominated Madison's political and cultural agenda.
On this MLK Day, you might be interested to hear Dr. Martin Luther King visited Madison twice. His last appearance was a speech at the UW Stock Pavilion in 1965.
Journalist and historian Stu Levitan is well known for his books documenting the city's history. His most recent book, Madison in the 60s. Stu, welcome back to Live
Stu,
at
good to
Four.
see you.
It's good to see you guys. Thanks for having me.
Let's talk about Madison in the 60s and Dr. Martin Luther King. He first was here in 1962.
Came here in March 30, 1962, spoke to about 1,300 people in the Union Theater. His talk was The Future of Integration. In fact, both speeches were called The Future of Integration, but they're very different speeches. In March 1962, to put Dr. King in context, he just turned 33. He was known primarily as the head of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and for his role in the Montgomery bus boycott of 1955-56. But he would not write the letter from Birmingham jail until the following April, would not give the I Have a Dream speech until August of 1963. So he was clearly the leading figure in civil rights, but he was not the global, enormous figure that the next 6 years would prove him to be.
And race relations in Madison at the time were not good.
Race was a very big issue, well, throughout the 60s, but in this particular time, the very time that Dr. King was here, in fact, the same page of the Capital Times on March 21st promoting the speech had two civil rights stories going on in Madison at that very time. There was a racist re-election campaign for the city council. Alder Babe Rohr was running down the south side, and news had just broken about the university trying to suppress the undercover film about landlords lying to blacks trying to get housing, getting apartment units. In fact, race was such a big issue at this time that 3 nights after Dr. King spoke, the second most important black leader in America, Malcolm X, also spoke on campus, and needless to say, their schedules were closer than their messages. Dr. King spoke about integration. He said segregation is on its deathbed. He criticized the churches for how segregated they were. He said President Kennedy had to be more aggressive eradicating segregation. Malcolm X spoke about the need for black separatism. So you had that microcosm on campus at that very time.
By the time he came the second time, he was much more well known, and it had a huge turnout in Madison.
In November 1965, he was the recipient of the Nobel Peace Prize. The civil rights movement had 2 huge accomplishments in just the previous 16 months with the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. So he addressed, his speech was on the economic and political impact and need for integration. He talked about the need for a massive federal program of public works, an increase in the federal minimum wage, expanded public education, talked about hiring blacks in law enforcement throughout the South. He said that we needed federal laws to protect civil rights workers. He said we needed federal jury standards to address the racist system of justice in the South.
He could make that speech today.
Well, that's a tragic irony that the same, and he talked about Voting Rights Act. He said that the Voting Rights Act had increased black participation, but southern states were coming up with clever new roadblocks, and we needed aggressive federal role. It's tragic. One final irony about the November 23rd, 1965, was also Election Day on campus for the Wisconsin Student Association. And among the campus politicians elected to the Student Senate that day was the former treasurer of the campus Friends of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, an undergraduate from Highland Park, Illinois, named Paul Soglin. But that, as they say, is a story for another day.
It certainly is.
We need a lot more time with you, Stu. Yeah,
Thanks for being with us today.
My pleasure.
You're working on another book, so hopefully we'll see you very soon.
Well, have me back.
Madison
1932 to 2006, and there are a lot of civil rights stories in that period.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Stu, thanks for being with us
Great to
today.
see
My
you.
pleasure. Thanks for having me.